Frost in her book, You Are Not American. For those of you not familiar with how this virtual format works, although you're not visible to us, you'll still be able to ask a question if you'd like. To do so, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. The chat function also will be active, and in that column, you'll find a link for purchasing a copy of You Are Not American. Amanda's a professor of law at American University, and she writes and specializes in the fields of constitutional, immigration, and citizenship law. You Are Not Alone is her first book. It's concise and crisp, and also authoritative in examining the disturbing history in this country of revoking or failing to recognize the citizenship of native-born or naturalized individuals. Amanda tells this sorry story engagingly through biographical accounts of individuals whose citizenship government authorities tried to strip away over the years, often motivated by a desire to shape society to a prevailing ideology or to a set of racial, ethnic, religious, and political preferences. A review of the book in the Christian Science Monitor called it an excellent primer on the importance of creating robust institutions that can check the formation of racist policies. And Publishers Weekly said, this troubling investigation of American exclusionism hits the mark. Amanda will be in conversation this evening with David Plotz, a journalist who's worked for or contributed to a number of news operations, among them the Washington City Paper, Slate, Harper's, and Business Insider. He hosts a popular weekly podcast, the Slate Political Gabfest, and runs CityCast, a local news podcasting firm. And he's written 2 books, The Genius Factory and Good Book. So Amanda and David, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Bradley. Amanda, congratulations on your first book. Also, those of you who don't know Amanda may not realize that the swanky wallpaper behind her signals that she's not in the US. Where are you and why are you up so late?
Yes, I am in France, and it's one of the only upside to COVID is I get to stay here. I was here last year, and it's 2 a.m. here, but the night is young in France.
At any hour, we should guard against citizenship being taken from Americans. So, Amanda, this book is great. You Are Not American is an excellent, really lively and grim book. And it is the story, in large part, it's the story of particular Americans who lost or came close to losing their citizenship and the battles they had to fight and the decisions that were made. So why don't we start by you telling us what person or what people haunt you most? What's the story that you think is most interesting or most relevant to us today about someone losing their citizenship?
Yes, and as I think about that, I think I'm sad to say that this story remains relevant, but the story that comes to mind immediately is the story of Hiram Rhodes Revels, who should be a household name, although he's not, because he was the first African-American in Congress. And he was elected in 1870 to represent the state of Mississippi as a senator. And in fact, he took the seat formerly occupied by Jefferson Davis, who went on to become the president of the Confederacy. So this was a really important symbolic moment, but he wasn't allowed to take a seat. For 3 days, there was debate on the floor of the Senate by those who argued that no Black man could be a citizen of the United States eligible to serve in Congress, regardless of the fact that the 14th Amendment, ratified just 2 years before, had said everyone born in the US is a birthright citizen. So Revels prevailed, he took his seat, but as we know, that battle for full citizenship rights continued on till today. And in fact, when I heard Barack Obama's citizenship baselessly being questioned throughout his presidency, I heard echoes of Revels' battles.
So for those of you who haven't read the book, there is a real potpourri of reasons that people have had their citizenship targeted. Why don't you run through some of the lowlights there? What are some of the most pungent reasons?
Yeah, and I will say, by the way, some of the stories are people prevailing over attempts to take their citizenship. So there's some uplifting moments in our nation's history, although plenty of grim ones. So of course, race is huge. I mean, race is threaded throughout the book. It's Dred Scott starts us off with Chief Justice Taney saying no Black person could ever be a citizen. And then, of course, taking us all the way through to today, race remains important. But that's not the only ground. So ideological grounds during the Red Scare, the labor leaders who had any sort of communist ties or affiliations and were naturalized citizens would lose their citizenship because of their speech and their activity. That was clearly why they were targeted. I think most shocking to me was women who married non-citizens lost their citizenship for about 20 years, even after they won the right to vote. So, of course, women had the right to vote in the Constitution, but if you married a non-citizen, you lost your citizenship and couldn't vote. And that was based on both xenophobia and, it struck me, the legislators were just angry at the idea that American women wouldn't marry our good American boys. And there was just some sort of jealousy or resentment there, as well as plain old xenophobia. So a wide range of reasons.
Is with the women who married non-Americans, I was talking to my kids about this tonight. Were there a lot of them?
Yeah, so it's funny, it's hard to get actual numbers on that, and I've looked into it, as has Candace Breadbenner, who's written on this. So it's not clear quite how many there were. There was, but if you look through Isadora Duncan, the dancer, Nellie Grant Sartoris, President Grant's daughter, lost her citizenship. Just a huge variety of people. A woman lost her citizenship who was deported to Canada and was impoverished, and we don't know what happened to her, but she may well, the Canadians didn't want her either, right? So I can't give you actual numbers, but it's clearly in the many thousands, tens of thousands. And those people all lost their right to vote, even if they weren't deported.
And I actually realized when you and I were talking about this sort of a few weeks ago, I don't know what citizenship means. What is citizenship? What are the rights and privileges of it?
I think citizenship has become more important as we've stopped discriminating on other grounds. Because to be a citizen means you have the right to vote. It means you have the right to hold elective office. It means you have the right to serve on a jury. All of those rights are not rights, obviously, you can exercise if you're not a citizen of the United States. There's also a number of jobs in federal and state government you can only hold if you're a citizen. But by far, the most important is the right to enter and remain in the United States. And that's where citizenship was used as citizenship stripping was used as a weapon, because labor leaders and others who posed a threat to the government could be deported or barred from entering if the government could convince a court they weren't citizens. And
generally, I guess there's no one answer to this, but why don't you talk a little bit about particular ways that courts have grappled with the attempts to strip citizenship, or have judges generally been like, good, go ahead, or have they been the force of protection?
They've played both roles. I mean, the Supreme Court, if you study it, you know it's not the hero that I think sometimes we'd like to see it be. Those of us who grew up, with Brown versus Board of Education as the most prominent case. There's plenty of times the Supreme Court sinks as low as you can get. So, of course, Dred Scott is one example. Mackenzie versus Hare, which was when Ethel Mackenzie, the socialite and suffragist who fought for women's right to vote in California and then married a non-citizen who couldn't vote, she brought her case to the Supreme Court and lost 9-0 unanimously. And the court said, well, you chose to marry a non-citizen, so it's your problem. But there are examples of the court leading the way. And I think probably the best example is Wong Kim Ark, which is an 1898 case, not well known even among lawyers and law students, that established birthright citizenship as the rule. And it was issued at a time when the United States was, there was an extraordinary amount of anti-Chinese animus throughout the country, lots of legislation targeting the Chinese. And yet the court in a 7-2 decision said, everyone born in the US is a citizen. That's what the 14th Amendment intended, regardless of race, regardless of the legal status of your parents. And so that case, the court really led the way.
And what is the status of birthright citizenship now? Because I'm trying to forget everything that happened in the last 4 years, insofar as that's possible. But I do remember there was some kind of burp around birthright citizenship that the Trump administration was doing.
Yes. So, all right, 6 years ago, 5 years ago, I would have said, there's no question. You're born in the US, you're a US citizen, zero question. It's still true today that there's zero question, but the Trump presidency started to bring it into question. So several times, President Trump said he thought he had the authority to take away citizenship from the children of undocumented immigrants. That's clearly a losing argument that lost in the Supreme Court in 1898, but he still made it. And by making it, he destabilizes the status of that group of people. You may remember Kamala Harris, who's the child of legal immigrants to the United States. There was claims made and Trump suggested she wasn't a citizen. I don't think he ever thought that would succeed, but he was trying to undermine her status and position, just as he actually remarkably successfully did with President Obama. I was shocked when I read in 2016 that a poll said that over half the Americans polled questioned whether Obama was a citizen. That was at the end of his presidency. So he was effective with these arguments that birthright citizenship isn't the rule.
But is birthright citizenship, I guess I'm trying to understand, is it, it's solidly there, or it's been eroded and actually could be taken away for groups?
So as I wrote this book, I intended it to be a history, but the last chapter is what's happened more recently, and it got longer and longer. And I realized these struggles are still very much with us today. So birthright citizenship so far has withstood the challenges, and the United States has a pure birthright citizenship rule. If you're born in the United States or you're naturalized, you're a citizen, and there should be really no question ever about that. I will say the last 4 years have made me realize how easy it is to erode these things I thought couldn't be questioned. So I would say I don't rest easy about it anymore, but it's still been a clear rule for a long time.
And birthright citizenship can be eroded because, for example, you can doubt whether someone was born here. You can question their papers, right?
Yes, so that's a good point. In the past, people questioned citizenship in the sense of, oh, okay, are you really a citizen? Did you really get status? Now the questions more go to proof of citizenship. So for example, the government claims that anyone born near the southern border of the United States who's born outside of a hospital, even if they have a birth certificate showing they're born in the US, the government presumptively decides they're not a citizen unless they can produce other evidence of their citizenship. And that's an extraordinary number of people that's affected, many thousands who sometimes are barred entry back into the United States. There's a political...
Can I just dig in on that? Because it's so interesting. It's midwives. It's people born from midwives in southern Texas, in southern Arizona,
yes.
Right?
Which is quite normal there, by the way, because hospitals are few and far between, and you might not get to a hospital. So using a midwife is a very normal thing to do in that area of the country. And everyone who's got a midwife signing their birth certificate is now presumptively not a citizen.
And what do they do to overcome that animus?
So I was looking at the State Department's website, and it said things like, well, if your family Bible notes when you were born, you could try to submit that, and where you're born. Or if you have a certificate from your primary school that says you attended, and that's in the US, or vaccinations in the US from a US doctor. But first of all, these documents are hard to gather. And secondly, why are they any better proof of citizenship than the birth certificate? It must be very, very difficult for those in that position.
You think there are thousands? There are literally thousands.
Oh, easily. Yes, because the rule now is that presumptively, if you're born outside of a hospital setting in the southern, near the southern border, there's a presumption that you're not a citizen, which, and by the way, this has got to relate to the population in that area, because can you imagine the population of upstate New York being told, well, everyone born to a midwife with them signing their birth certificate, we're going to presume you're not a citizen? That would never happen. So this says a lot about what we think about the people living in the South near the southern border.
This is kind of an aside to your book, but as I was reading it, I did get to start thinking about members of sovereign tribes. If you were born into a sovereign Indian tribe, is your citizenship status exactly the same as if you're not and born in Sibley Hospital?
So the status of Native American citizenship is fascinating, and it deserves a book of its own. And the 14th Amendment, which created birthright citizenship, very much in response to Dred Scott and to the Civil War and to the end of slavery, it actually accepted Native Americans. So those born on reservations as part of tribes are not automatic birthright citizens under the 14th Amendment. But federal legislation makes all of those people birthright citizens through legislation. So there's no difference in the status today, but that's due to legislation.
Interesting. And there's no, but that's legislative, not judicial. Well, forget it.
Not a constitutional,
yeah.
But I'll just mention the reason for that is it's actually, the motivation behind that was sympathetic, which is the idea was it wasn't clear that Native Americans, especially in 1870, automatically wanted to be US citizens. And if they were made US citizens, often that undermined tribal sovereignty. So the idea was the country didn't want to impose that on Native Americans at that time.
I'm going to pause for 1 second just to note, I haven't checked, but please put your questions in the Q&A. Amanda and I are going to talk for another 15 minutes or so, and then we're going to turn to you. So put your questions at the bottom. There's a place for Q&A. Please put your questions there. What happens when you lose your citizenship? What is the process? I guess maybe we can talk about today, or we can talk about historically. Do you get expelled from the country, or you can stay here? What happens?
So all different ways in which people's citizenship were questioned. Sometimes it was when they tried to come back into the United States. So Wong Kim Ark, who was born in the United States, went to visit some family in China, and he's not allowed off his steamship when he arrives in San Francisco, and I think it was 1895. And so he's forced to stay on his steamship for months while his case goes through the courts. Other individuals like Ethel Mackenzie, the socialite suffragette, nothing happened to her other than she couldn't vote. So no one was trying to deport her, but she couldn't vote. She couldn't exercise this right that she'd fought so hard to get for American women. And then today, or rather under Trump, it's not clear what will happen with Biden. There's a denaturalization campaign where we have 20 million naturalized citizens in this country, and the government started investigating 700,000 of them. And it would bring court cases and take away their citizenship. And then if it won the case, it would deport them. So
this thing deserves, I mean, we could talk for an hour about this, but let's talk for the next few minutes about this. This is Operation Janus. Just go, I mean, it's shocking when you get into the details of this. So as you say, 20 million naturalized citizens, and they decide, why 700,000? What did those 700,000 people do to get investigated, and what has happened?
It is not clear. Like that, I can't tell you, but I will tell you that the Trump administration threw tens of millions of dollars in this. They opened up, in fact, maybe more like $100 million of this. They opened up a new office in Los Angeles entirely focused on denaturalizing US citizens. I went to one of these trials. The amount of resources, they had 3 government attorneys trying to denaturalize a man who'd been 30 years in the US, 10 years a citizen, married to a US citizen kid, no criminal record, and yet they wanted to kick him out of the country and were willing to spare no expense to do so. So it is extraordinary, the denaturalization effort. And before the Trump administration, an average of like 8-9 people a year would be denaturalized. And they were all people like former Nazi war criminals who had lied about their past. They were people that you could say, all right, that person really should be denaturalized. The Trump administration took this to the new level. It was part of an anti-immigration move on their part.
And do you have a sense of the scale of the successful denaturalizations?
Well, you know, it's funny, as Marsha Gessen said, who's a reporter for The New Yorker and herself a naturalized citizen, they destabilized the position of naturalized citizens simply by starting the investigation. She said, my sense of permanence is gone. I'm a second-class citizen now. But putting aside that, how many people were actually affected? The government said it wanted to refer 1,000 cases a year for denaturalization. It didn't succeed. It was incompetent. so that's good. But that was its goal. And as I said, 700,000 people under investigation.
And there's a chilling moment in your book, and I think it's the one that you observed, which is that isn't the brother of the person who's being investigated goes to testify to his brother's good name or good nature or whatever it is, and the government starts to question the citizenship of the brother who's testifying.
Yeah, so I go to this denaturalization case in Florida, fly down there. I have to say it's disturbing. I was one of 2 people in the audience, which is, you know, this is part of, we just don't have enough reporters anymore. And like, this deserved to be covered, right? So I'm watching, and the brother of a man who's being targeted for denaturalization is testifying on his brother's behalf. So he's just a witness. And the government attorney doesn't ask him about the man they're targeting to denaturalize. They start asking him about his basis for citizenship. And the lawyer objects and stands up and says, this is irrelevant. You're intimidating this witness. The judge allows it. And the message that was sent was, if you stand up and bring yourself to the government's attention and you're a naturalized citizen, watch out.
Yeah. Do you have a sense about whether the Biden administration intends to continue this, or did it stop dead?
I would be shocked if they intended to continue this. Although I do think it's interesting, lots in the news, as it should be, about the Biden administration's proposal to provide a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. And one of my arguments is, yeah, let's also make sure legal immigrants can become citizens, because there were lots of slowdowns and difficulties in naturalizing before the election, which may have been intentional. And as I said, a denaturalization campaign. But I'm sure this is not the Biden administration's goals. I'm sure they don't share that goal.
A question just came through over chat, which I think is a good one. Going back to the case you saw, why were they investigating this person for denaturalization anyway?
So they said there was an error in his visa when he arrived in the United States. And this man, there was. He had problems with his visa. As I said, it was 30 years before. And there is a question about whether that's really a worthwhile case to go after. I will say a different case that I looked into, a teenager, a man who came to the United States as a teenager, lived in the United States 30 years, over 10 years a citizen. He was denaturalized based on what is clearly a typo. Sometimes these cases are brought for very frivolous reasons. Other times the more substantive problems with the application.
And was the one you went to, was that person denaturalized or not?
Yes, he was.
And but he's married to an American, he has American children, but he no longer can live in the United States, or he can live here?
The next move in his case will be for the government to try to deport him, which requires going before an immigration judge. And I don't know if that's happened yet, but it's hard to imagine they denaturalized him just to say, all right, you get to stay.
So if you were no longer a citizen, even if you were married to a US citizen, you do not have a right to be here?
If you don't have legal status. So he had a green card and then had become a citizen. And the government said, you never should have been given the green card, and therefore we're denaturalizing you. Their next step will be to say, and you have new legal status, and so we can deport you. And
could he then, in some number of months or years, attempt to come in as a spouse and seek a green card, or are you just kind of X86 forever? If
any of my students are on, they're like, this could be on the exam. There are various waivers and exceptions, but the bars start as a 10-year bar. That's the best case scenario. So I would say that if you've been denaturalized for some fraud, some problem with your original visa, your chances of getting back into the United States are slim.
Historically, how many people do you think have lost their US citizenship?
The number, when I started this book, I thought this is really interesting and symbolically important and important in lots of ways, but I don't think I'm dealing with a lot of people here. I didn't think it was going to be more than, 100,000, 200,000. It's clearly millions. Now, it depends on how you define it. But, Chief Justice Taney said, all Black people in the United States, whether free or slave, are not citizens. That was 4.5 million people. And when he said that hadn't been clear before that. Blacks had ratified the Constitution. They had the vote. There was plenty of Black people who fully thought of themselves as citizens of the United States. It was Chief Justice Taney stripping citizenship from 4.5 million people. Then you've got tens of thousands of women, if not more, losing their citizenship. You've got denaturalization campaigns. You've got the mass deportation of families of Mexican heritage, both in the 1930s and the 1950s, and that amounts to over 1 million people. The numbers are significant.
Over 1 million people, many of whom were citizens?
Yes, over 60% were citizens, is what scholars estimate that number to be.
And was there any effort to redress that later?
No.
Those...
No, I will say, in fact, that there's quite a lot of evidence that the state Senate in California investigated this and did a really beautiful job of it and eventually apologized for its role in this. The clear effort in the 30s, which was, of course, during the Depression, was to deport these families and do so in a way where they couldn't come back. So they were often taken away in the middle of the night or coerced into leaving with no ability to keep documentation of their citizenship. And I profiled 2 people who did come back, and they came back with the help of people in the United States who tracked down their birth certificates. But they were often the exception. So others couldn't come back, couldn't prove it.
Millions. But of those millions, not most of, except I guess in this case of these Mexican Americans, most were not forced out of the United States.
Yeah, I would say the majority remained in the US, and often it was a way in which to, partly just to, symbolically to say, you are not American, you're not us. It was also political, right? You can't hold office, you can't vote, you can't participate as a citizen. And it was also a shot across the bow, particularly for labor leaders or activists, to say, if you make too much noise, if you cause too many problems, then your situation is precarious and we can deport you and remove you. And that was a way of silencing, quasi-citizens who were at risk.
So, as you read the book, dear listeners, dear watchers, you will be outraged. I think one thing that will kind of take the temperature of your outrage will be, is what the United States is doing the same as what other countries are doing, different, worse, better? How do we compare? What are we good at? What are we bad at?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, and something actually I'm beginning to look at more, because I think the comparative perspective is really interesting. The US wasn't alone in this. France, there was some examples of this in France and in England as well, where, for example, women who married non-citizens lost their citizenship in these countries as well. But I think the US has a special history and legacy here for a number of reasons. We're a country of immigration. 3/5 of the world's immigrants came to the United States over the 19th century and into the 20th. And I think there was a real struggle there to decide who we were as a nation, and citizenship stripping in a way epitomizes that struggle. Yes, you're one of us. No, you're not. There was sort of this push-pull. And of course, racialized slavery and the Civil War, and the fact that we've never fully addressed all of the issues created from that period of time is another reason why citizenship and citizenship stripping remain particularly important in the United States.
Do other countries have birthright citizenship in the way we do?
No, the United States is really exceptional in our pure birthright citizenship. So England used to have it, it's abandoned it. France used to have it, it's abandoned it. Germany never really had it. So the United States is really unusual, but I think it's really the best of American exceptionalism. And it relates to the fact what I've just said, that we are a country that does have this aspiration to welcome all newcomers. Senator Charles Sumner, the great radical Reconstruction senator, said the 14th Amendment birthright citizenship provision, it's intended to eliminate caste and oligarchy of skin. That was his goal for this provision. Now, of course, we've too often failed, but the idea is whoever you are, whatever your parents, wherever they come from, whatever their status, we are all the same. We are all members. We're all Americans. That was the goal of birthright citizenship.
I should note that my price for doing this event this evening is that I asked Amanda to investigate my citizenship status in the UK, because I was born in the UK, and it turns out that I have birthright citizenship because they started stripping of people after me.
You were born long enough ago. We won't say when.
Yes.
By the way, I did tell you, don't give up your US passport yet.
Yes, no, I won't.
Good.
It's not necessary. But so that's great about birthright citizenship. Great, good. But shouldn't naturalized citizens who have made this extra effort, shouldn't be as welcoming and shouldn't they feel as much a part of America as birthright citizens? And did it used to be that we were more welcoming of naturalized citizens?
Yeah, so let me be clear. The 14th Amendment says all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States. So it does include naturalized citizens. And in fact, they clearly are meant to be just the same as birthright citizens. There's no difference once you get that naturalized status. The only difference is you can't be president, because you have to be a natural born citizen to be president of the United States. So I think we try to be very welcoming. And in fact, we have an easier path to citizenship than many countries. So after holding a green card for 3 years, if you're married to a US citizen, 5 otherwise, you can become a citizen. So I think the naturalized citizens are meant to be, both in the Constitution and in our culture, as accepted and as much members as those born in the country.
But a birthright citizen can never lose their citizenship, but a naturalized citizen can't.
Well, it's true. And that's why the denaturalization campaign of the Trump administration was so very disturbing, because it turned naturalized citizens who are supposed to be the same as everyone else into, as Marsha Gessen said, second-class citizens, those who, if they testify at a trial, suddenly risk having their citizenship questioned. I have to say there was a great moment in a Supreme Court, a terrible moment, but a fascinating moment in a Supreme Court case and this was back in 2017, not that long ago, where the Chief Justice asked the government lawyer, he said, would you denaturalize me if I'd driven 65 miles an hour in a 60-mile-an-hour zone? No one's caught me. I didn't get a ticket or wasn't stopped, but I did it. And then I failed to note that in my naturalization application. Would that be a basis for denaturalization? And the government attorney said, yes. The government lost the case. So court did the right thing there. But it's hard. Your point is a good one. You're not really equal if your naturalization is so clearly at risk.
One category of people, this is sort of slightly different kind of person than what we're talking about, is I've often wondered if people who come and have legal status in the United States and choose not to become citizens, they choose to remain citizens of whatever country they were, for whatever reason they choose not to take the last step and become citizens. Should they be second? Should they be treated with all the respect and decency that the United States treats its citizens, or sometimes not?
Yeah, and I mean, let me be clear, although obviously my book is about citizenship, and I think citizenship is extremely important. If you live in the United States, actually, whatever your status, including those without documentation, you have constitutional rights and protections. It may be hard to access them in real life, but the Constitution refers to persons more often than it does citizens. So that's the first point. And the second is, yes, we should treat our the non-citizens living among us with respect. We should give them ability to be maybe not the full-fledged members of the citizen where they're voting or serving on juries, but they certainly should have many of the same rights and privileges. And I think we're moving in that direction, although we're not there.
Is the status of someone who is in Puerto Rico or Guam or the District of Columbia any different than that of someone who's from Maryland?
Yeah, so that's also a fascinating question. So those in Puerto Rico are birthright citizens, just the same as anyone born in the mainland US. But of course, it's only when they come to the US that they can start voting in the presidential elections, which was interesting to watch that immigration pattern. There is some questions about citizen versus national status for some folks born on territories such as the Mariana Islands, and I don't want to get too much into the legal weeds on that. But yes, those territories are really interesting, and I'll recommend a book called How to Hide an Empire, which deals with those issues and is fascinating and a good read.
All right, so we're going to go to the Q&A because there's some fantastic questions in here, which I wish I'd thought of. So I'm going to start. I'm going to start in the chat and then move over to the Q&A. But please put your questions in the Q&A section. So Ine Riveras asks you, Amanda, do you think there is any valid reason to strip someone of their citizenship?
Yes, so first of all, hi, Ine. Glad you could make it. And the answer, I've thought a lot about this because actually one of the stories in the book is about the fact that Confederate leaders like Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis lost their citizenship or their citizenship rights, perhaps to be slightly more accurate about it. And they couldn't hold office. They couldn't vote for much of, for at least a period of time, many years. And then posthumously, Congress granted them back their citizenship in Robert E. Lee in 1975, Jefferson Davis in 1978, which is just sort of shocking that this happened. And these men were celebrated in the discussions about giving them citizenship back. When I thought about this, I thought, but I didn't really want them not to be citizens. I think our country needs to own people like that. We need to admit that they were Americans too, that they did these things that I find appalling and fought for slavery, and yet they were Americans. I can't deny that. So I would say citizenship stripping is almost never justified. Here's when I would accept it. When someone is a naturalized citizen and it turns out that they lied about the basis for obtaining citizenship about something both very serious and in the recent past. So the perfect example is the Nazi war criminal who makes up a new name, comes to the US under false pretenses and turns out to have been a guard at a death camp. That person, I don't have a problem taking their citizenship because the basis for granting it was fraudulent and there was a serious error in their application, a serious example of fraud, not a typo.
The Marion Usher asks, this is a very particular question. Did Alexander Hamilton become a naturalized citizen? What was the founders?
Yes. Great question, Marion. I don't know. It's funny. There's a book out about the law of Hamilton. So if anyone wants to buy that book, I recommend it. Although I haven't read it, but it looks like it would answer that question. I don't know much about Hamilton's legal situation, but I will say that the founders were well aware that some of them wouldn't qualify for birthright citizenship. So they sort of added the caveat that if you're a citizen as of the date of the founding, that's good enough. Office, et cetera.
Julie Sue says, notes, and maybe that you could comment on this, that you can lose birthright citizenship if you affirmatively renounce your citizenship.
Yeah, that's a great point, actually. And that's very consistent with our Declaration of Independence, which says, you get to choose your government. And that was something that was really remarkable and new about the Declaration of Independence and the formation of the United States. The people choose their government. And to be consistent, it should mean that you get to leave. You get to choose not to be a citizen. And I have no problem with that. So you can renounce your citizenship, and that's a way to lose your citizenship. That's different, of course, than the government forcing you to give it up, right? But yeah, there's a provision that says you're allowed to renounce your citizenship with an affirmative and clear act, and that's it. Every American can do it. But David, as I said, don't you do it.
If you renounce your citizenship, though, renouncing your citizenship doesn't mean you don't have to pay taxes or you don't have to obey the law, right? If you're still here.
No, it's funny, actually, there are some Americans living abroad who've renounced their citizenship because the United States has made it so difficult to hold a foreign bank account. I've heard some of these people complaining. But if you're living in the United States, no, you still have to follow the laws, just like you would if you're a non-citizen living in the United States, an immigrant. You're required to follow the law regardless.
Anonymous attendee asks a question which I think a lot of us wonder about. Can an American have dual citizenship?
Absolutely, yes. So dual citizenship pools turn in part on what the other country requires, the one you're trying to get another citizenship in. But the United States has no problem with people having dual citizenship. It can't control whether another country gives you citizenship. So it'll give you U.S. citizenship. And if you can go to another country that also allows you to hold that citizenship at the same time you have U.S. citizenship, sure, you can have 3 citizenships.
But why do I remember, maybe I'm thinking of some scene from a movie where you have to renounce your loyalty to foreign potentates, don't you, when you become a citizen?
No, you have to swear allegiance to the United States, but that doesn't preclude another country saying we're fine with you being a citizen, even if you've sworn allegiance to the United States.
Does the United States treat a dual citizen differently than a regular citizen? Or no?
No, and it's funny. It used to be something that was very disfavored in the law, and that's part of the reason why women who married non-citizens the law presumed that they'd automatically lost their citizenship and taken their husbands, because back in the early part of the 20th century, the U.S. was very uncomfortable with dual citizenship. No longer, so you can hold both citizenships. At this day and age, it seems like a wonderful. If I could get French citizenship, I would.
The anonymous attendee, very busy today, anonymous, also asks, can you please speak to Marsha Blackburn's Banned Birth Tourism Act and recent trends in birth tourism, particularly among Chinese and Russian populations?
Yes, this is such an issue. This comes up again and again, both in news stories and legislation. There's no question that some people come to the United States to give birth, to give their children birthright citizenship. The question is, how many people is this? Is it some problem? And why are we so terrified of it as a nation? So, I've talked to people from Turkey who describe this happening. There's some evidence that some people from China come to the US so they can have a child in the United States and that child will have US citizenship. It's a pretty small subset of people that have the ability to do this. So it's not a big group. But it's interesting how much it sort of captured the imagination and disturbs people that this could be happening.
And is do you know whether the Blackburn bill has any chance of passing? Has it gone anywhere? Has it been voted on?
Yeah, no, I don't.
Is it unconstitutional?
So it would be very difficult to see how they draw whatever line they're trying to draw once the person's there. They couldn't constitutionally once the person's giving birth in the United States. But what they could try to do is create various rules and limits on coming into the United States while pregnant, which I think is already de facto the case. Because Customs and Border Patrol will scrutinize a person's reasons for coming to the US if they're visibly pregnant. But once the child's born in the US, the 14th Amendment guarantees citizenship.
Luke Hancox asks, was England and France's abandonment of birthright citizenship in some way tied to their colonialism or some other combination of factors?
So colonialism and citizenship is fascinating because, of course, France and England had colonies where they had created relationships with populations. And at that point, even after the colonial era ended, they continued to allow access to citizenship more easily for people from those countries, as I think was, and I think they were correct to do so, right? There's a creation of a relationship between the countries. And some people argue that the United States has a quasi-colonial relationship with countries in South America and should also have easier immigration and citizenship rules for people from those countries. And I think that's a really interesting analogy to make.
The wait, there was a question that I had that just came out of that, which was it'll come to me. I'll read Mark Graber's question instead. Mark asks, Americans often play a variation on citizenship. Rather than strip people of citizenship, we limit rights of citizenship. So in 1880-ish, people suddenly discovered that voting was not a right of citizenship when women wanted to vote. Do you see this as an issue in the contemporary United States? They will respond to some immigrant groups not by stripping them of citizenship, but by claiming citizens do not have certain rights we once associated with citizenship.
So that's where I think one of the ways in which I think the whole evolution of citizenship is so fascinating is, of course, for a long time, voting and citizenship were not tied together, as Mark well knows. And thank you, Mark, for coming. For a long time, voting and citizenship were two separate things. So you could women were viewed as citizens, but of course they couldn't vote until the 19th Amendment was added to the Constitution. White men without property couldn't vote for some chunk of time. And interestingly, non-citizens in the early years of our country often could vote if they were men of wealth. Jamie Raskin, who many will know as their representative or be familiar with him in Congress, he wrote a great law review article on this and explored this topic. So citizenship wasn't always connected with civil and political rights. Today, though, it really is. And it's also the case that you can't deny the right to vote or serve on a jury or all these other civil and political rights for any of the reasons we used to, right? You can't limit it because the person is poor or the person is of a different race or religion. That's off the table. But as citizenship became the line, the marker for getting rights, then the government became more aggressive about taking away citizenship because it was a proxy for discriminating on other grounds.
Anne Claire asks, I want to hear more about citizenship stripping of women marrying non-citizens. What were the justifications given for this, and how was it justified that men marrying non-citizens should retain their citizenship?
Yes, so I mean, this was so clear what was going on here. So men who married non-citizen women, what the justification Congress said is the men will guide and educate their non-citizen wives in the ways of the United States and help those women become full-fledged US citizens. But women who married non-citizen men, there was two arguments made. One is the women are selling themselves for titles of nobility. This makes me think of Henry James and Isabel Archer. And this sort of fantasy of Congress, or this nightmare of Congress, that all these women were running off and marrying, counts and dukes in Europe. And they wanted to punish those women. That was actually very small percentages of the marriages. It was less than 1% of the marriages of US citizen women to non-citizen men were to European aristocracy. In fact, a lot of the marriages were to Canadians. So that was one of the real problems. In terms of why Congress did this, it's sort of unspoken reasons, xenophobia, the idea that we don't want the children of these non-citizen men. We don't want these families to be responsible for them. They're not us, right? And at the bottom, this book is a lot about that. It's about the symbolic meaning of citizenship as well as the rights and privileges that attach to it.
That is the only, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's the only example in the book where the target is not specifically racial. I mean, like the others are Mexican, Central American immigrants, yeah, Asian Americans, Black Americans.
So race it is so huge in this story, and it is so much what is going on, whether it's spoken or unspoken. I will say women marrying non-citizen, I mean, of course, part of that is the xenophobia and racism involved in the idea of the American woman going off and marrying the foreigner. But white women who married white men were deeply affected, of course, too, as Ethel Mackenzie was. And I'll also point out another chapter in the book deals with the ideological citizenship stripping of people like the labor leader, Harry Bridges, and others, journalists, labor leaders, who basically caused problems. And the government said, oh, you're not born in the United States, you were naturalized, and we're finding you troublesome. Let's see if we can get rid of you. And they targeted these people for denaturalization.
I wonder if the people they targeted for denaturalization in Operation Janus, whether they went after people who were outspoken.
So what I saw, the pattern I saw from the first few cases was they went after men from predominantly Muslim countries. So Pakistan, well represented in the first set of cases. There was no white people in the first set of denaturalization cases.
Another great question from Ine Riveros. Can you say anything about the 2020 census and its impact on citizenship? What the Trump administration was trying to do and what the Constitution actually says about the census and people in the United States?
Yeah, great, because this is not over, this fight. So the question is how we decide how we allocate our representatives in Congress. And it has been the case for a long time now that you allocate the number of representatives given to each state in Congress based on the total population. That includes people that don't vote, like children and like immigrants, whether legal or undocumented. And that can be a very large percentage of the population. So California, I think the government estimates like 5% of the population is undocumented immigrants. So the Trump administration tried to say, you can't get representation in Congress based on the undocumented immigrants that live in your state. Of course, Biden immediately has rescinded that, so it's now no longer a fight. But individual states are trying to change the way in which their representation is allocated, like Missouri, and others have threatened to do so. So this fight will stay in place. It's not going anywhere.
I mean, I'm a liberal, a good liberal, really, but I'm slightly sympathetic to that argument. Why is it so absolutely wrong to think that the allocation of where representation should be is where the citizens are?
Yeah. So first of all, you're not alone in questioning that, and I think it is a really interesting question because you and I could think of hypotheticals where it actually would be really troubling. So I'll give you a hypothetical that actually would confirm your suspicion that maybe this isn't a good thing. Imagine a state in which all of the non-citizens are agricultural laborers, and the citizens are, the people who employ them. And yet they get more representation in Congress because of all the undocumented or even documented but not citizen workers around them. And then they pass laws that exploit those workers, right? We could easily imagine that coming to pass. So I will say that I have some sort of reasons to hesitate as well. But I also think that the very theory of our representative democracy is our representatives represent all of us, whether we vote or not, whether we choose to vote, whether we're registered to vote, whether we're children, whether the children of the state don't vote, right? So that has always been the theory, and to change that underlying truth or theory about the way in which we're represented in Congress is also deeply disturbing to me.
Yes. Although it's not true that every person is counted in the census. If you're a tourist, if you're visiting, you don't get counted, right?
Yeah, so there's by the way, this was a Supreme Court case that the court punted on about 2 months ago for those who followed this. So yes, there's a question about, if you're here for a fleeting visit, are you excluded from the census? And the answer is yes.
Are there any changes you'd like to see made to the law to prevent citizenship stripping being used in a punitive way, asks Josh Frost.
Yeah. Hi, Josh. So are there changes? So I think for today, for the modern day, what most concerns me are two aspects of the current law. One is proving citizenship and the difficulty of doing that and the hurdles to doing that, including sometimes to vote, right? Which is what Chris Kobach tried to do in Kansas. And in fact, he disenfranchised about 31,000 people during the time that his law was in place in Kansas, people who couldn't prove they were citizens. So I want to make sure that whatever the proof of citizenship regime was, it was taking into account the fact that if you're going to require high hurdles to proving citizenship, you're going to do the equivalent of taking away people's citizenship. So I think that's probably most important, but also the way we police citizenship. So if you live within 100 miles of the US border, you can be stopped by the police and questioned, detained, arrested. And this has happened time and again to people who are US citizens, but they just can't prove it to these border officials' satisfaction, or people trying to get into the United States who can't prove it, particularly if they're birthright citizens, right? Because there's less paperwork, right? Because they're just born in the US, that's their claim to citizenship. So I also care about the way in which it's policed at the borders and at ports of entry.
People living within 100 miles of the borders, I think you said, are 2/3 of the American population.
Yes, because the border is defined very broadly. So
is the border the Atlantic Ocean also?
Yes. Oh, yes. The border is the ACLU is a great map that shows you this, right? The border is like the entire, all the coast of the United States, and ports of entry, like airports in the interior, could be, places in which people are stopped, questioned, arrested without the same constitutional protections that you get in other parts of the country.
Was that 100-mile? Where did that 100-mile rule come from? And is that something that Congress did, that the INS or whatever we call them now did?
Yeah, so it's, first of all, the Supreme Court was implicated in this because it's the one who said there's a border exception to the normal rules for policing people and deciding whether they have Fourth Amendment protections or not. So the Supreme Court is partially responsible. And you ask a good question. I'm sure we could look at it, but I don't know where the 100-mile rule comes from. I'm sure we could change it, but I don't know which government agency or court is responsible for that.
Aaron Lloyd asks, did you explore the court cases regarding lack of citizenship of those in the Philippines after the Spanish-American War, which were American colonies?
I didn't, but I'm fascinated by that. So if ever asked that question, wants to follow up and we can explore it together. I didn't.
Praveen Fernandez asks, President Trump asserted on more than one occasion that non-citizens were not entitled to due process rights, despite the clear text of the Due Process Clause, which uses the word person as opposed to citizen. This was never seriously in question before the Trump administration. What do you think the long-term effects of the destabilization of this concept will be? Are there other rights that were not limited to citizens, but have now been falsely yoked to citizenship that you have concerns about going forward?
Yes, so I was going to say, in some ways, my book is, you could criticize it for saying that I give too much emphasis to citizenship, because really at the bottom, right, we're all people who should have a set of rights regardless of our immigration status or our naturalization status. And that is indeed what the framers intended, which is why they wrote the Constitution, as I already mentioned, to refer to persons and not citizens the majority of the time. So, of course, the Trump administration was wrong to say due process is limited to citizens. I think that's so clear what was actually going on with arguments like that. The argument was, we get to decide who's a citizen, and it's not someone who looks like you, right? Or it's not someone with your set of beliefs. And that's where part of the impetus for my book was to say citizenship has been used as this proxy for identity and belonging. And we no longer can overtly say, well, it's race or it's your ideological beliefs, but we're going to call it citizenship and then target people for denaturalization or target people to question their citizenship when they're at the border or trying to come into the US.
Alma Pilar Gutierrez asks, what do you think will happen to the rights and citizenship of US-born wives of recruited ISIS fighters? And I guess she refers to a recent Frontline episode, which I don't know about, but maybe you do.
Yes. So, and by the way, I should quickly add, you talked about other countries. There are other countries that have said that people should lose their citizenship if they're proven to be terrorists. England has done this, and it's somewhat symbolic, but they have actually taken an effort to take away citizenship from some. So I believe the ISIS fighter that's being referred to in the question, or the wife of an ISIS member, I believe her father was a diplomat. So the argument was, you're a birthright citizen if you're born in the US, with a couple of exceptions. And one is if you're the child of a diplomat. So the government, I believe that was the argument they made in that case. And that is an exception to the 14th Amendment. But the 14th Amendment otherwise can't prevent someone from being a citizen just because you don't like who they married or you don't like their set of beliefs. And in fact, Justice Felix Frankfurter, very movingly, in 1944, he was the author of a Supreme Court opinion reversing the denaturalization of a German American who'd naturalized, who was clearly pro-Nazi and pro-Hitler and anti-Semitic. And Frankfurter himself, Jewish, the only Jewish member of the court, said, I don't like this guy, but you have the freedom to speak foolishly as an American, and you get to still be an American. You may have consequences for your actions, but one of them isn't losing your citizenship. And I think he got that right.
We're just going to get to the last couple of questions. Before we get to the last couple of questions, I want to note that in the chat, there is a link to buy You Are Not American from Politics and Prose. And I would really exhort you to buy it. We were talking before that in pandemic, because we can't gather together, when we used to gather together at PNP, we would all go buy the book, and there'd be lines to get your book signed by Amanda. I'm sure Amanda would find some way to electronically sign this, but now we can't do that, but we should still support Politics and Prose by buying Amanda's book and a lot of other books from them. So please hit that link, buy the book, and maybe buy something else while you're there. So before we exit, though, Jacoba Azarian asks, going back to this question of people who voluntarily renounce their citizenship, like Vietnam War protesters or tax cheats, does the government honor their request? If you try to renounce your citizenship, is it like, that's it, easy peasy? Does the government have to do it?
Yeah.
And do you become stateless?
Yeah, well, what's interesting, what's interesting is you actually have to make your intent very clear. And for those who are interested in doing this, although I don't think any of us should feel as interested anymore since last Wednesday, but you can go on the State Department website and it says what you can do to clearly renounce your citizenship. Because of course, it can't be used to be the case that if you did anything to suggest you were less than fully committed to the United States, like vote in a foreign election, you would lose your citizenship. So that kind of inadvertent, unintentional act no longer does it. But if you clearly want to renounce your citizenship, you put it in writing. I'm sure you have to sign it under penalty of perjury or oath, rather, make an oath of some kind. Then you can renounce your citizenship, and you just have to follow the State Department's guidelines on that. So it's clear under law you're allowed to do that, and somehow.
Someone has posted, Janet Kurjan has posted the Naturalization Oath, which says, the first sentence is, I declare on oath that I absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure allegiance and fidelity to any foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereignty, of which I have heretofore been a subject or citizen. So how does that, how do you reconcile that with dual citizenship?
Yeah, so the idea is that the United States can say whatever it wants about becoming a US citizen, but it can't control what other countries do. So I also saw somebody in the chat said, well, some countries won't let you have dual citizenship. Fine, then you can't, if you want to be, I think they said Tanzania, I don't know. If you want to be Tanzanian, you can't also be a US citizen, you have to choose. But other countries don't have a problem with dual citizen, right? I mean, don't we all know dual Canadian US citizens, or I certainly know dual French US citizens. And each country can require you to make some sort of oath, but at the end of the day, they can't control what the other country does regarding your citizenship. And as I said, dual or even people with 3 citizenships is not unusual these days. So it's permitted if the other country is okay with it.
All right, go into your chat. Buy You Are Not American right now. Amanda Frost has written a great book. Amanda, congratulations.
Thank you.
Bring us out before Bradley comes back. Do you have any last words to say?
Yeah, the only thing I'll say is, I mean, of course, so much of this conversation is a conversation about facing some hard history in the United States and some grim moments, as you said. But there's also moments in the book, because I loved focusing on those moments, that were really uplifting, where Americans fought for each other to retain each other's citizenship, to fight for groups like the imprisoned Japanese Americans who were coerced into renouncing their citizenship, but then got it back, right? So, or US citizen women who were elected to Congress and amended the law, repealed the law that took away citizenship from women who married non-citizens. So I guess I want to just tell people who might want to read the book, it's not all a sad story about the United States. There's some uplifting moments too.
That's very encouraging to hear. Great moderating, David, and great effort at getting everyone watching to buy Amanda's book. And Amanda, what a revealing work of legal history. It really does make one think about the meaning of being an American and the preciousness of citizenship and the upsetting lengths our government has gone sometimes, including very recently, to try to take it away from people. To all of you watching, thanks for tuning in. As David said, read Amanda's book and you'll be outraged. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.
Thanks everyone for coming, and I really appreciate the support of everyone taking another hour out of their lives to be on Zoom to see this. So, and thank you, David, and thank you, Politics and Prose.